What a shock it was for me when I got through listening to the full audio from the Middle Eastern, as he describes himself, character witness who worked with George Zimmerman for several months. My video, King of the Malcontents, was made after listening to a very small clip of that audio on the news. In that clip, the Middle Eastern man describes how George mocked him using a character called Ahmed the Terrorist. And I knew in my gut, in my bones, just what George Zimmerman was up to from that tiny snapshot from what this man said George did to him. The Middle Eastern man eventually described George as a bully. Well, as I said at the top, later on I got a chance to search for the full audio statement from this man. And listen, my jaw doesn't drop very often. But as I approached the end of that audio, my jaw literally dropped. It was shocking to me how closely witness 22, that is the Middle Eastern man, how closely his observations about George's modus operandi, how closely it matches my own impressions. And remember, my impressions were based on only a tiny bit of that audio. Witness 22 believes George targeted him because he sensed he was not well accepted at work, what with being Middle Eastern and being a new employee. George fed off of this perceived vulnerability and taunted the man and made him an object of derision before his colleagues. George made it virtually impossible for this man to function in his job. George made that workplace a very uncomfortable place for witness 22 to be. That Middle Eastern man couldn't say a single word in a meeting without George mocking him, which produced laughter and snickers from other employees, who witness 22 calls the guys. His co-workers no longer respected him. He couldn't be taken seriously. And this was all George Zimmerman's doing. It was a malicious and vile thing to do. I don't like the term bully. It doesn't adequately describe the sort of sophisticated psychological warfare that people like George Zimmerman engage in. George Zimmerman was much more than a bully. There was something seething and dark about his ways. Witness 22 said that George was eventually let go because he called Human Resources Hotline so many times to complain about every manager and every employee. George believed he knew how things ought to be run in that operation. He believed he had the experience to direct things and that management should take his advice. You see, all this, it just blows my mind. You know why? Because I knew it. I knew it about him. I knew it when I heard George correct the police dispatcher when he asked George what apartment number he lived in. And George responded that it was a, quote, home. What an odd thing to say at this critical moment when there is presumably a suspicious person in the area. And especially considering that George was a renter. He didn't say house, which would be the opposite of apartment. He said home, which has a special meaning and which creates an entirely different impression. And the thing is that George thought it important to point out the distinction between an apartment and a home at this critical moment to someone on the phone who really did not give a damn. The guy was just a dispassionate operator doing his job and trying to get the information. I knew it when George boasted that he was off to work with a relative in his multi-million-dollar operation right after school. However, the records show an unfocused man who never really seemed to find his direction in life. But so what? Lots of people are unfocused. Lots of people rent. It isn't something to be ashamed of. Was George ashamed of his status in life? Was he hiding from the world who he really was? There was that grandiose sense of self where George believed he was so clever he could get something over on new employee, witness 22, by tricking him to take out the trash, which was not part of the man's duties. George was so enraged that his mentee didn't fall for it. He took to openly calling the man, quote, a fucking moron, in front of everybody. Finally, at the end of his rope, the Middle Eastern man composed a letter to management complaining about George. Here's the thing. Apparently a meeting was called, and this gentleman, the Middle Eastern man, said that George acted so sincere, so professional at the meeting, that this man actually started to doubt his own self. Witness 22 said George had two faces. One face glared at him and taunted him, while the other face was sober and cool and in control before management. George knew exactly how to act to get himself out of trouble. Well, eventually, George was let go. And this gentleman, the character witness, seems to think George was let go because he misused the HR hotline, not necessarily because he harassed him. This man was so relieved when George was gone. He said he threw a party in his house. And he said that his relationship improved with his colleagues after that malevolent force, George Zimmerman, was gone. As I said, it was jaw-dropping to hear this because I knew it. And I have a feeling we are going to discover many more dark things about George as this case progresses. I just have a feeling there is something coming, something really, really ugly. I don't know what it is. Something about George Zimmerman that we will discover. Can you imagine what this poor man had to endure at George's hands? And the Middle Eastern man was an adult. He had the tools to handle somebody like this. But still, he said he had to go home and talk himself down from retaliating physically against George. George provoked this man almost to physical confrontation. This is very important to the Trayvon Martin case. So here's a boy, a 17-year-old boy in an unfamiliar environment. Trayvon had been at the retreat for 7 days, not nearly long enough to feel at home. He's walking. It's dark. There's no moon out because of intermittent rain. There are houses on both sides of him, but the pathway is dark and lonely. And there is a hostile, malicious, violent monster, George Zimmerman, stalking him. Now, the Middle Eastern man, being an adult and having the tools and experience of adulthood, might have known to stay on the main pathway for safety. He might have known that if he was scared that he was being followed, that he should knock on a door and ask someone for help. Trayvon did seem to remove the iced tea can and the candy from the plastic bag the clerk gave to him and put them in his pocket on his hoodie. I imagine that it was easier to run without a bag in your hand slowing you down. But still, that kid, he never stood a chance against a man with hostile intentions, an out-of-control man with a gun. He was just a boy, just 3 weeks into his 17th year. Trayvon had never faced anything like this before in his short life. But he did his best. Thanks for listening.